Inside Corcoran SHU, how California's prison silence breaks the human mind. The door doesn't slam. It seals. No countdown. No warning. Just a final mechanical click that tells the brain something ancient and terrifying. You are no longer part of the world. Inside Corcoran Security Housing Unit, silence isn't peace, it's pressure. Minutes stretch. Thoughts loop. Memory misfires. And over time, the mind begins to do something it was never designed to do. Turn inward, aggressively, without relief. This isn't about violence. It's about what happens after the violence is gone, and the silence stays. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. Corcoran State Prison sits in California's Central Valley, surrounded by farmland and open sky. A sharp contrast to what happens inside its most restrictive housing. The Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU, was designed to remove influence, disruption, and danger from the general population. On paper, it is a control mechanism. In practice, it became an unplanned psychological experiment, one that researchers, courts, and correctional officials would later struggle to explain. This documentary is not an attack, and it is not a defense. It is an examination. Using verified findings from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, peer-reviewed psychological research, and federal investigations, we trace how extreme isolation alters perception, emotional regulation, and identity itself. Not through rumor, not through exaggeration, but through documented human behavior under prolonged confinement. The architecture of silence. The first thing most inmates notice in Corcoran's SHU is not the size of the cell. It's the absence of reference. No consistent human voices. No predictable sounds. No markers that separate one hour from the next. Psychologists studying restrictive housing environments describe this as stimulus deprivation, a condition where the brain receives too little external input to regulate itself properly. Without variation, the mind begins to manufacture stimulation internally. In Corcoran's SHU, this often starts subtly. An inmate might count footsteps during meal delivery. Another memorizes the rhythm of ventilation. Some begin talking, not to others but to the space itself. CDCR records and court testimonies show that many SHU inmates entered isolation without diagnosable mental illness. Months later, clinicians documented symptoms that were strikingly consistent. Difficulty concentrating, emotional flattening, sudden irritability, and distorted time perception. One former SHU inmate described days that felt stacked on top of each other, impossible to separate. Sleep became fragmented. Memory became unreliable. The brain, deprived of interaction, started folding inward, replaying old conflicts, imagined conversations, and unresolved fears on a continuous loop. Researchers from the National Institute of Justice and the American Psychological Association note that this process isn't weakness. It's adaptation. The mind attempting to survive an environment with no social feedback. But adaptation has a cost. As weeks become months, the internal world grows louder while the external world fades. Emotional responses dull, then spike unpredictably. Small frustrations trigger outsized reactions. Not because of aggression, but because emotional regulation depends on social contact. In Corcoran's SHU, that contact is deliberately limited. By the end of the first year, some inmates report something more unsettling than fear or anger: detachment. A sense that reactions no longer match reality. That consequences feel distant. That identity itself has thinned. This is the point researchers warn about, where isolation stops being temporary control and begins reshaping cognition. And once that shift happens, returning to normal interaction is no longer a simple reversal. When the mind becomes the cell, long before the body weakens, isolation targets something more fragile: mental orientation. Inside Corcoran's SHU, the environment doesn't just restrict movement, it disrupts the brain's ability to organize reality. Psychologists describe this as a breakdown in context processing. Without changing stimuli, the mind loses its external anchors. Time, emotion, and identity begin to blur. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow internal drift. Early on, inmates report heightened alertness. The brain, deprived of normal interaction, becomes hyper-focused. Sounds feel sharper. Thoughts move faster. Sleep becomes shallow, interrupted by long stretches of wakefulness where the mind refuses to settle. According to research cited by the American Psychological Association, this state resembles prolonged stress activation. The nervous system stays switched on, with no opportunity to reset through normal social cues. Over time, that constant vigilance becomes exhausting and then disorganizing. At Corcoran, clinicians documented a recurring pattern. Inmates who initially appeared stable began to struggle with attention fragmentation. Reading became difficult. Following simple routines required effort. Thoughts jumped without warning, often looping back to the same unresolved memory or imagined conflict. One former SHU inmate later described it as thinking without steering. The mind moved, but not forward. As isolation continued, emotional responses began to change. Not disappear, change. Anger didn't fade. It lost proportion. Sadness didn't deepen. It flattened. Fear no longer warned. It lingered. Researchers from a National Institute of Justice observed that in restrictive housing, emotions often detach from their original triggers. A minor inconvenience can provoke intense frustration, while significant events register weakly or not at all. The emotional system, designed to calibrate itself through human feedback, no longer receives correction. In Corcoran's SHU, this imbalance created a paradox. Inmates appeared calmer on the surface while experiencing internal volatility. Correctional reports sometimes noted compliance, fewer outward incidents, even as mental health evaluations showed rising distress. This disconnect is critical, because from the outside, isolation can look effective. From the inside, it is destabilizing. As weeks turned into months, some inmates developed what psychologists call perceptual distortions. Not hallucinations in the cinematic sense, but subtler shifts. Sound seemed farther away or closer than they were. Time felt elastic. Days compressed or expanded unpredictably. One inmate testified during a federal review that he stopped trusting his own reactions. He couldn't tell if he was overreacting or underreacting, only that his responses felt delayed, like echoes. This loss of internal calibration is not incidental. It is a known effect of prolonged social deprivation. Studies referenced by researchers Craig Haney and John Irwin emphasize that identity is reinforced through interaction. Without it, the sense of self becomes unstable. At Corcoran, that instability often expressed itself through detachment. Inmates described feeling less connected to consequences, not in a reckless way, but in a distant way. Actions felt abstract. Outcomes felt hypothetical. This is especially dangerous in environments designed to prepare individuals for eventual reintegration, because reintegration requires responsiveness. The longer isolation continued, the harder it became to re-enter even controlled social settings. CDCR mental health assessments noted that some SHU inmates struggled during brief interactions. Eye contact felt overwhelming. Voices felt intrusive. Proximity triggered anxiety rather than familiarity. This wasn't defiance. It was overstimulation. The brain, having adapted to scarcity, now treated normal interaction as a threat. Researchers liken this to sensory shock. When deprived systems are suddenly flooded with input, The response is not relief, it is stress. In Corcoran's SHU, this meant that even limited steps towards social exposure required careful management. But not all inmates received that transition. Some were returned directly from isolation to less restrictive environments with minimal preparation. Correctional records indicate that this abrupt shift often resulted in disciplinary issues, not because inmates became more violent, but because their regulatory systems were misaligned. Impulse control weakened. Emotional thresholds dropped. Communication broke down. From the outside, it looked like noncompliance. From the inside, it was overload. Perhaps the most troubling effect documented was identity erosion. Without mirrors of social response, inmates began to describe themselves in increasingly abstract terms, not by roles or relationships, but by sensations. Tired, numb, detached. The language of self narrowed. Psychologists warn that when identity contracts, agency follows. Decision-making becomes reactive. Long-term thinking collapses into short-term survival logic. This is not criminal thinking. It is adaptive isolation thinking. And it does not switch off automatically. Federal evaluations of restrictive housing practices in California highlighted this risk repeatedly. Isolation can reduce immediate disruption while increasing long-term instability. Corcoran's SHU was never intended to rewire cognition. Yet evidence suggests that is precisely what prolonged exposure did. Not through cruelty, through absence. By the time inmates left the SHU, whether through policy changes, legal intervention, or sentence progression, many carried invisible effects. Difficulties trusting their own perceptions, trouble regulating emotion, a lingering sense of unreality that made ordinary interaction feel unfamiliar. These outcomes raise a question that researchers continue to debate. If isolation changes how the mind processes the world, what responsibility does the system have for managing that change? Because once the mind becomes a cell, the door opening does not guarantee freedom. Adaptation that doesn't undo itself. Isolation doesn't simply damage the mind. It reprograms it. Inside Corcoran's SHU, inmates didn't just endure confinement. They learned how to function within it. Psychologists emphasize that the human brain is not passive. When placed in extreme conditions, it adapts. The danger lies not in adaptation itself, but in what those adaptations are optimized for. In the SHU, survival meant minimizing stimulation, flattening emotion, and narrowing attention. Over time, these traits became internal rules. Mental shortcuts that reduced distress inside isolation, but caused friction everywhere else. This is where many outside observers misunderstand solitary confinement. The absence of visible breakdown is often interpreted as resilience. In reality, it can signal deep internal restructuring. Correctional mental health reports from California documented inmates who appeared adjusted to SHU life. They followed rules. Incidents decreased. They stopped requesting services. On paper, this looked like stability. Clinically, it was often the opposite. Researchers noted that long-term isolated inmates frequently exhibited emotional constriction, a reduced range of effect that made them appear calm while masking cognitive fatigue and detachment. Emotion wasn't gone. It was compressed. One former Corcoran SHU inmate later explained it this way. Reacting felt pointless. Not because he didn't care, but because caring required energy he no longer had. This pattern aligns with findings from the American Psychological Association, which describe isolation-induced apathy as a conservation response. When stimulation is scarce and stress is constant, the brain limits output to preserve function. But this comes at a cost. Emotional narrowing weakens empathy. Reduced empathy disrupts social repair. And without social repair, conflict escalates faster. When inmates transitioned out of the SHU, many struggled to recalibrate. Normal prison environments, with noise, movement, and unpredictable interaction, overwhelmed systems conditioned for deprivation. CDCR assessments recorded increased anxiety during routine interactions. Voices felt intrusive. Eye contact felt confrontational. Crowded spaces triggered physiological stress responses. This wasn't fear of people. It was loss of tolerance for complexity. In isolation, the environment is simplified. Choices are few. Variables are controlled. Once the brain adapts to that simplicity, reintroducing complexity creates instability. Some inmates attempted to recreate isolation conditions psychologically even after leaving the SHU. They withdrew socially, limited conversation, avoided group activity. This behavior was sometimes misinterpreted as antisocial. Clinicians recognized it differently: protective withdrawal. The mind was defending itself against overload. This became especially problematic when inmates were expected to participate in programs designed for rehabilitation or reintegration. Group discussions, conflict resolution exercises, and collaborative tasks required cognitive flexibility, the very capacity isolation had weakened. Research by Haney and Irwin highlights this contradiction clearly. Environments that reduce immediate risk through isolation often undermine long-term behavioral regulation. In Corcoran's SHU, this tension played out repeatedly. Inmates released from isolation were often disciplined not for violence, but for misunderstandings. Misreading tone, responding too intensely or not at all, violating social expectations they no longer intuitively grasped. One documented account described an inmate who became overwhelmed during a routine interaction with staff. He wasn't defiant. He froze, unable to process multiple instructions at once. The response was disciplinary, not therapeutic. From a systems perspective, rules were broken. From the psychological perspective, regulation had failed. This disconnect highlights a critical issue. Adaptations formed in isolation are context-specific. They work inside the SHU. They fail outside it. Yet the system often treated these failures as character flaws rather than environmental consequences. Another long-term effect observed was temporal disorientation. In isolation, time is abstract. Without social rhythm or meaningful variation, the brain stops tracking duration accurately. Days blend. Memory compresses. When inmates re-entered structured environments, deadlines felt arbitrary. Waiting felt unbearable. Patience, which depends on time awareness, was impaired. This had real consequences for behavior. Impulsivity increased, not because of recklessness, but because future consequences felt unreal. Decision-making shifted toward immediate relief rather than long-term outcome. Researchers caution that this effect is particularly dangerous in correctional settings, where impulse control is critical for safety. Yet once again, the root cause was rarely acknowledged. Perhaps the most enduring adaptation was identity simplification. In isolation, identity shrinks to essentials: survival, routine, internal dialogue. Social roles disappear. Feedback disappears. The self becomes self-referential. When inmates left the SHU, many struggled to expand that identity again. They felt disconnected from group identity, institutional identity, even personal history. Some described feeling like observers rather than participants. This isn't dissociation in the clinical extreme, but it is detachment. And detachment complicates accountability, growth, and rehabilitation. Federal reviews of California's restrictive housing practices repeatedly raised this concern. Isolation may suppress behavior in the short term, while eroding the psychological capacities required for long-term stability. Corcoran's SHU did not exist in isolation from these findings. Court oversight, policy reform, and public scrutiny eventually forced changes, limiting duration, increasing mental health review, and expanding step-down programs. But for many inmates, those changes came after years of exposure. Adaptation had already occurred. And adaptation, once formed, does not simply reverse when conditions improve. The brain remembers what it needed to survive, which leads to the central question raised by psychologists studying Corcoran and similar facilities. If the system creates adaptations that make reintegration harder, can it still claim isolation as a neutral management tool? Because control achieved through absence leaves a residue. and that residue follows the mind long after the door opens. When control becomes invisible, isolation doesn't announce its impact. It hides it. By the time many inmates left Corcoran's SHU, the most significant changes were no longer obvious to staff, courts, or even the inmates themselves. The adaptations had become internalized, automatic responses shaped by years of restriction. Psychologists describe this stage as internalized control. The environment no longer needs to enforce silence or limitation, because the mind has learned to do it on its own. At Corcoran, this phenomenon surfaced repeatedly in post-SHU evaluations. Inmates complied with rules not because they felt oriented or stable, but because initiative itself had faded. Decision-making narrowed. Risk avoidance dominated behavior. From an administrative viewpoint, this looked like success. From a psychological viewpoint, it signaled erosion. Research referenced by the National Institute of Justice shows that long-term isolation often produces behavioral passivity. Not calmness, passivity. The difference matters. Calmness preserves responsiveness. Passivity reduces it. In Corcoran's SHU, many inmates learned that action rarely changed outcomes. Requests were delayed. Appeals moved slowly. Interaction was minimal. Over time, the brain adjusted by lowering expectations. This adjustment has a name: learned helplessness. It does not mean surrender. It means adaptation to uncontrollable conditions. Once learned helplessness sets in, motivation declines. Not because of laziness, but because effort feels disconnected from results. The mind conserves energy by disengaging. CDCR mental health documentation recorded inmates who stopped participating in available services, not out of refusal, but indifference. They attended when required, spoke when asked, and withdrew afterward. This withdrawal was not always visible as distress. It was visible as absence. Another effect documented was emotional predictability. Inmates learned which emotional expressions triggered intervention and which did not. Over time, expression flattened into a narrow, neutral range. Not honesty, not deception, optimization. Psychologists warn that when emotional expression becomes strategic rather than spontaneous, authenticity erodes. Relationships suffer. Trust weakens. Communication loses depth. When inmates later interacted with counselors, officers, or peers, this emotional narrowing created misunderstanding. Responses appeared rehearsed. Engagement seemed shallow. But this was not manipulation. It was survival learning. One former SHU inmate described feeling like he was performing stability rather than experiencing it. His words aligned with clinical observations. Emotional control achieved through suppression rather than regulation is fragile. When pressure increases, suppression fails. This helps explain why some inmates experience sudden breakdowns long after leaving isolation. The system interpreted these episodes as unpredictable. Psychologists saw them as delayed reactions, because internalized control holds until it doesn't. Another invisible consequence was moral detachment. In isolation, ethical reasoning becomes abstract. Without social consequence, feedback, or dialogue, moral frameworks lose reinforcement. Right and wrong become rules to follow, not values to understand. This distinction is critical. Rules require enforcement. Values require integration. Research by Owen and others emphasizes that moral development depends on interaction, discussion, disagreement, repair. Isolation removes these processes. At Corcoran's SHU, inmates often followed rules precisely while struggling to explain their purpose. Compliance existed without comprehension. This gap matters when individuals are expected to self-regulate. When external control diminishes, internal guidance must take over. But if that guidance was never exercised, behavior becomes unstable. CDCR evaluations noted that some post-SHU inmates struggled with judgment in ambiguous situations, scenarios not covered by clear rules. Without internalized norms, decision-making defaulted to avoidance or impulse. Neither supports rehabilitation. The effects extended beyond behavior into self-perception. Years of isolation altered how inmates interpreted their own reactions. Some reported distrust of their emotions, assuming any strong feeling was dangerous or inappropriate. Others dismissed emotional responses altogether. Psychologists refer to this as affective disconnection, when individuals lose confidence in emotional signals as guides. Without emotional feedback, learning slows. Growth stalls. This becomes especially problematic in therapeutic settings, where progress depends on reflection and emotional awareness. Inmates conditioned to suppress internal response struggled to engage meaningfully. From a system's perspective, therapy appeared ineffective. From a psychological perspective, the foundation had been weakened. Perhaps the most troubling invisible effect was future collapse. Isolation narrows temporal focus. Long-term planning fades. The future becomes abstract. Researchers describe this as foreshortened time horizon, a belief, often unconscious, that future outcomes are irrelevant or unreachable. At Corcoran, some inmates expressed difficulty imagining life beyond immediate survival. Goals felt fictional. Change felt implausible. This mindset undermines any environment designed to prepare individuals for eventual release. Rehabilitation assumes belief in consequence, possibility, and continuity. Isolation disrupts all three. Federal oversight reports repeatedly flagged this contradiction. Restrictive housing stabilizes institutions while destabilizing individuals. By the time inmates reached reentry pathways, many carried adaptations invisible to screening tools. On paper, they were compliant. Clinically, they were disconnected. This is the danger of invisible control. It doesn't look like harm. It looks like order. But order achieved through internal withdrawal leaves individuals unprepared for complexity, responsibility, and social negotiation. Corcoran's SHU was not designed to produce this outcome. Yet, documented evidence suggests it did. Not intentionally, but systematically. Which raises a question larger than Corcoran itself. If control becomes internalized through disengagement rather than understanding, is stability truly achieved or merely postponed? Because systems don't only shape behavior. The aftermath the system doesn't see. The door opens, but something doesn't walk out with the body. Freedom arrives faster than the mind can follow. For inmates leaving Corcoran's SHU, release is not relief. It is collision. Noise at first. Voices overlap. Movement feels aggressive. The brain, trained for absence, interprets presence as threat. Short interactions feel long. Crowds feel endless. Eye contact burns. Psychologists call this reentry shock. Not fear. Not defiance. Overload. CDCR records show that many former SHU inmates struggle most during the first weeks outside isolation. Not because rules are unclear, but because stimuli are too many. Decision-making slows. Impulse control weakens. Patience collapses. The mind is still living in scarcity. One former inmate described simple choices as exhausting. Where to stand? When to speak? How loud is acceptable? Every action required calculation. Before isolation, these decisions were automatic. After isolation, they were work. This matters because correctional systems interpret hesitation as resistance, silence as attitude, withdrawal as refusal. But psychology sees something else, a nervous system relearning reality. Another common effect appears quietly, emotional mismatch. Small problems trigger large reactions. Serious consequences feel distant. This isn't irresponsibility. It's distorted calibration. The brain learned to survive where consequences were delayed, abstract, or irrelevant. Now it must adapt to immediacy again. Some can. Some struggle. Some fail. Research from the APEA and NIJ shows that without gradual transition, the risk of disciplinary infractions rises, not due to violence, but misinterpretation. Misread tone, wrong timing, too much emotion, or none. This is where the system often loses patience. The inmate is told to adjust faster. The mind cannot. Another lingering effect is distrust, not of others, but of self. Former SHU inmates report questioning their reactions constantly. Am I overreacting? Am I numb? Is this normal? That uncertainty slows growth. Confidence is fragile after isolation. So is identity. Years without social reflection shrink the sense of self. When interaction returns, the self has little structure to stand on. Some retreat, some overcompensate, some shut down. None of this shows up neatly on a report. And that is the problem. Isolation leaves no visible scar, but leaves patterns. Patterns in response. Patterns in avoidance. Patterns in emotional distance. Corcoran's SHU did not end these patterns when the door opened. It passed them forward, into general population, into re-entry programs, into society. This is the part rarely discussed. Not what isolation does inside, but what it changes after. Because when the environment trains the mind to disappear, returning it to the world requires more than release. It requires repair. And repair takes time the system rarely provides.